Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey back to a world both distant and strange, a time when grand stone castles rose across the landscape, their walls sheltering nobles and knights, servants and cooks, all bound by the rhythms of medieval life. This world was not like ours. The days were long, the nights colder, and the meals, well, they were unlike anything we might expect today. Before we settle in, take a quiet moment to pause. Maybe stretch a little, adjust your blanket, and allow yourself to drift slowly into the past with me. If you find this gentle exploration of history soothing, consider liking and subscribing, but only if it feels right to you. And if you're comfortable, share in the comments where you're listening from, what hour it is for you, because in this quiet moment, we are connected across time and space. Now, dim the lights. Perhaps let a soft breeze whisper through your room, the faint rustle like leaves outside a medieval castle's high windows. Together, let us step through the great oak doors and enter the grand halls, where the clatter of utensils and the murmur of voices once mingled with the scent of strange and curious foods. This is the world of medieval castle feasts, where what was served on the table could be unexpected, even bizarre, by today's standards. Let us begin. In the heart of medieval Europe, where rolling hills met dense forests and rivers carved winding paths through the land, the castle stood as a dominant feature of the landscape, rising like a fortress against the sky, often built of cold grey stone and crowned with towers and battlements. These castles were not merely military strongholds, they were centers of power, administration, community, and culture, places where the lives of many converged in an intricate web of hierarchy and tradition. The castle was a microcosm of medieval society itself, a place where lords and ladies governed, knights trained and servants carried out their duties, all under one roof, or rather within one sprawling complex. Life in and around a castle was defined by routines shaped by seasons, politics, and social obligations. At the heart of many of these routines lay food, an essential yet complex element of daily existence. Far beyond simple sustenance, food was a language spoken silently at every feast and meal, communicating wealth, status, hospitality, and sometimes even power. The dining hall was one of the most important rooms in the castle. Its vast wooden tables, long benches, and high ceilings echoed with the quiet clatter of plates and utensils, the rustling of embroidered clothing, and the subdued murmur of voices. In these spaces, food was presented not only to nourish but to impress. The castle's kitchens were labyrinthine and bustling, usually situated in an outbuilding or below the great hall to keep smoke and heat away from the main chambers. There, cooks and kitchen hands worked tirelessly, chopping, roasting, boiling, and seasoning meals that ranged from the mundane to the extravagant. The food served reflected the seasons and the resources of the surrounding lands, but it also carried the mark of the castle's wealth and the tastes of its lord. Feasts were occasions that required extensive planning, large quantities of ingredients, and the labor of dozens of servants. They were social events where alliances were forged, messages conveyed, and status asserted, often through the very dishes placed before the guests. At a glance, the castle might seem a place of harshness. Stone walls, cold draughts, and the constant threat of war lurking beyond its gates. Yet inside, there was a rhythm, a kind of order, especially around the preparation and consumption of food. The lords of the castle saw their kitchens as a reflection of their power and prestige. The more elaborate and exotic the dishes, the greater the impression made upon visitors. In fact, the serving of unusual or rare foods became a kind of spectacle, a way to demonstrate connections and influence that extended beyond the castle's walls to distant markets, traders, and even royal courts. Understanding the role of food in medieval castles requires stepping beyond modern expectations. The foods served often seem strange or even unappetizing to the contemporary palate. Ingredients that today might be discarded or considered odd were prized delicacies. Flavors combined in ways unfamiliar to us, and certain animals or parts of animals were staples in a diet shaped as much by availability and necessity as by taste. The preservation of food, lack of refrigeration, and the reliance on what the local environment provided all contributed to this culinary landscape. This story of medieval castle food is not merely about what was eaten, but how the act of eating was embedded in social structures and daily life. From the grandeur of the noble feast to the humbler meals of the servants, the castle table reflected the broader medieval world, its hierarchies, beliefs, and practical challenges. As the seasons turned and the castle hosted celebrations, religious observances, or moments of simple daily routine, food was a constant presence, a force that bound together a diverse group of people in shared experience. The strange and sometimes unsettling dishes that appeared on medieval castle tables are windows into this world, revealing the tastes, fears, and aspirations of those who lived within these stone walls. Through understanding the food, one gains insight into the castle's place in medieval society and the rhythms of life that shaped an era often seen as distant and mysterious. As we begin this exploration of the weirdest foods served in medieval castles, it is essential to keep in mind the environment in which these foods were prepared and consumed. The castle was a place where practical necessity met display and ceremony, where scarcity met abundance, and where tradition met innovation. From this fertile ground grew a culinary culture, both fascinating and peculiar, a culture that speaks to us across centuries through the remnants of recipes, accounts of banquets, and the very stones of the castles themselves. And so, as the great doors of the castle closed behind us, and the glow of torchlight casts flickering shadows upon stone walls, we take our place at the vast wooden table, ready to discover the strange flavors and curious dishes that defined medieval castle feasts. This journey begins not just with food itself, but with the social world that gave it meaning, a world where every meal was a story told in taste, texture, and tradition. The social world of the medieval castle was a complex tapestry of rank, duty, and privilege, woven tightly into every aspect of life, including the food that appeared on the table. As the great oak doors closed behind those who entered the grand hall, they were stepping not just into a physical space, but into a carefully constructed hierarchy that dictated every detail of existence, from the garments worn to the portions eaten. The castle was not merely a home or fortress, it was a stage where social distinctions were made visible, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the distribution and quality of food. At the very summit of this social pyramid stood the lord and lady of the castle. Their status afforded them the finest foods, the most elaborate dishes, and the largest quantities. The lord's table was a place of power, where every meal was an opportunity to display wealth, assert influence, and entertain important guests. Dishes served to the lord were often composed of rare or expensive ingredients, spiced and prepared with care, intended not only to nourish but to impress. Elaborate pies stuffed with game, delicate pastries, exotic spices imported from distant lands, and fine wines were common features at these tables. The lord's plate was often piled high, a visual testament to his prosperity and authority. Directly below the lord and lady were the knights and higher-ranking retainers. These individuals formed the core of the castle's military and administrative power. Their meals were substantial, designed to sustain bodies that engaged in rigorous physical activity, but lacked some of the extravagance reserved for the lord. Meat was central to their diet, often in the form of roasted or boiled fowl, venison, or beef, accompanied by bread, cheese, and seasonal vegetables. Though less lavish, their food was still far above what the lower classes consumed, reflecting their relatively privileged position. Further down the social ladder were the lesser servants, squires, and specialized workers. Their meals were simpler and less varied. Bread, pottage, a thick stew made from grains, vegetables, and occasionally small amounts of meat or fish and cheese were staples. These foods were practical, designed to sustain labor rather than to delight the senses. The quality of the ingredients here was noticeably lower. Leftovers from the lord's table might be passed down, but fresh or choice cuts were rarely seen. For many of these individuals, meals were eaten quickly and in separate, less formal spaces, far from the grand feasting halls. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the lowest servants, kitchen workers, and sometimes even prisoners or visiting laborers. Their diets were the most modest, often repetitive and lacking in variety. Porridge, coarse bread, and vegetables were the primary fare, with meat being a rare luxury. The food here was more about survival than pleasure, and its preparation was basic. This group ate separately, often in cramped and dark quarters away from the noble family and their guests. The distinctions in food reflected the broader societal divisions that characterized medieval life. The castle's rigid hierarchy was maintained through numerous means: clothing, space, language, but perhaps none was as tangible and immediate as what one ate. To sit at the Lord's table was to affirm one's rank, to enjoy the benefits of privilege, and to partake in a ritual of power. To eat from the servant's hearth was to accept one's position within the larger system. Interestingly, the way food was served also reinforced these social boundaries. The Lord and his guests were waited upon by a retinue of servants who brought dishes in a precise sequence, often beginning with lighter, more delicate foods and progressing to heartier fare and sweet desserts. The manner in which food was presented and consumed was a performance, an unspoken dialogue of respect and obligation. Serving a lord or lady incorrectly could be seen as an insult or a breach of etiquette, sometimes with serious consequences. Moreover, the quantity of food served was an indicator of status. The Lord's table might be laden with multiple courses, abundant with different types of meat, breads and sweets, while the lower tables featured fewer dishes, often repetitive and plain. Food was also an indicator of gender roles within the hierarchy. Men generally received larger portions and meat, while women's meals might be somewhat lighter, though still varied according to their status. These differences were not merely about privilege, but also about access. The Lord controlled the lands around the castle, which provided the resources, game, crops, livestock, used to produce food. Those at the top could dictate what was hunted, harvested, and brought to the kitchen. For example, hunting rights were often reserved for the nobility, making certain game birds or deer exclusive to their tables. Peasants and lower servants were forbidden from hunting, thus their diets lacked such delicacies. Religious and seasonal considerations also played a role in the social distinctions of food. Certain days required fasting or abstaining from meat, affecting all ranks but often observed with varying strictness depending on social standing. The wealthy might substitute fish or exotic alternatives, while poorer folk simply ate simpler meals. The observance of such rules sometimes emphasized social divides, with feasts timed to celebrate religious festivals or important events, offering the Lord a chance to display generosity and reinforce social bonds. While the food itself was a marker of status, the sharing of meals was equally significant. Invitations to dine with the Lord or his family were gestures of favor and inclusion. Being served at the Great Hall was a privilege, a momentary elevation in the social order. Conversely, exclusion from such events could underscore one's lowly position or fall from grace. Behind the scenes, the social hierarchy influenced the kitchen staff as well. Head cooks and stewards held important roles, often coming from the lower gentry or skilled artisan classes. They managed the complex logistics of food preparation, procurement and service. Their knowledge and expertise were crucial, but their social standing limited their access to the finest foods, even as they produced them for the Lord and his guests. In sum, the social hierarchy of the medieval castle was intricately connected to food. Every dish served, every portion shared, every feast celebrated was shaped by the invisible yet unyielding lines of status and power. To understand the strange and curious foods that emerged in these settings, one must first grasp the world in which they were created. A world where food was not simply nourishment but a language of hierarchy, a symbol of privilege, and a tool of governance. As we move from the social structures that shaped the medieval table, we begin to see how the feasts themselves became events of great importance far beyond mere meals. These elaborate gatherings, steeped in ritual and meaning, reveal even more about the culture and customs of medieval castle life. In the world of medieval castles, the daily routine of eating simple meals was only one facet of the complex relationship between food and society. More significant in the cultural and political life of the castle were the grand feasts, banquets where food transcended mere nourishment to become a powerful language of display, diplomacy and hierarchy. These feasts were events of immense importance, occasions that shaped the social fabric of the time and the very exercise of power within the castle walls. Feasts were planned affairs, often tied to religious festivals, important family events such as marriages and births, or moments of political significance like the arrival of a high-ranking guest or the celebration of a military victory. The scale of these gatherings could range from a few dozen to several hundred attendees, depending on the status of the host and the occasion. Yet, regardless of size, the underlying purpose was consistent: to exhibit wealth, cement alliances, and reinforce social bonds. One must understand that in medieval society, power was frequently expressed through material means, and food was among the most visible and immediate manifestations of wealth. The ability to procure rare ingredients, to prepare numerous courses, and to serve in an orderly and lavish manner was a testament to the resources controlled by the lord of the castle. These displays were intended to impress not only the guests but also those who might hear of the feast afterward, through word of mouth or written accounts. At the heart of the feast was the Great Hall, a large chamber designed specifically for such gatherings. Here, long wooden tables stretched beneath high vaulted ceilings, lit by the flicker of candles and the glow of braziers. Tapestries adorned the walls, muffling sound and adding color to the space. The lord and his closest companions were seated at the high table, elevated above the others, in a physical and symbolic demonstration of rank. Servants moved quietly among the tables, bringing dish after dish, while minstrels or jesters sometimes provided entertainment to fill the spaces between courses. The number of courses served at a medieval feast could be staggering. While exact menus varied depending on the region, season, and status of the host, it was not uncommon for a banquet to include upwards of 10 or even 20 courses. These would often begin with lighter dishes such as soups or broths and progress through various meat, fish, and vegetable preparations before culminating in sweet dishes and elaborate desserts. Each course was an opportunity to showcase different skills, ingredients, and presentations. Food at these feasts was more than simply fuel for the body. It was a form of communication. The inclusion of exotic spices from the east, intricate pastries shaped like animals or castles, and roasted game from the lord's hunting preserves were all deliberate choices meant to impress and convey messages about wealth, sophistication, and connections. The lavishness of a feast could bolster a lord's reputation, making him appear more powerful and influential. The political dimension of feasting was also profound. Invitations to dine at a lord's table were highly prized, conferring status and favor. Sharing a meal could seal alliances, settle disputes, or negotiate terms. In some cases, the scale and expense of a feast were seen as acts of generosity and diplomacy, reflecting the lord's ability to provide for and protect his followers. Conversely, withholding invitations or excluding certain individuals could be a subtle form of political signaling, emphasizing divisions and hierarchies. Religious significance was woven deeply into the fabric of feasting. Many banquets coincided with holy days and feast days when fasting rules were relaxed or ceremonial meals were prescribed. The Church's influence extended to the types of food permitted and the manner in which they were consumed. The ritualistic breaking of fasts and the celebration of saints' days provided occasions for particularly grand feasts, where the sacred and secular intertwined. Yet, feasts were not without their challenges and contradictions. The abundance of food served at some events often contrasted starkly with the scarcity experienced by many living within and beyond the castle walls. The spectacle of wealth displayed through food could highlight social inequalities, even as it temporarily brought together disparate groups under a shared roof. Waste was common, with some food consumed and much more discarded or given away. This excess was part of the ritual, emphasizing the lord's capacity to provide beyond mere necessity. Preparation for a feast required careful organization and considerable labor. The castle's kitchen staff worked for days, sometimes weeks, sourcing ingredients, preserving meats, baking breads, and cooking dishes over open fires and large ovens. Spices and exotic ingredients had to be procured through trade networks that spanned continents, involving merchants who brought pepper from India or cinnamon from Ceylon. The complexity of these preparations underscored the connection between the local and the global in medieval cuisine. Guests at a feast were also expected to observe strict etiquette, reflecting their place in the social order. Seating arrangements were meticulously planned, with proximity to the lord indicating rank. The use of utensils, the order of serving, and even the choice of which hand to use for certain foods were governed by unwritten rules. Breaches of decorum could result in offense or scandal, adding a layer of formality to what might otherwise have been a convivial gathering. The feast, in essence, was a carefully choreographed event where food served as a symbol of continuity and control. In a world often marked by uncertainty, it was a moment when the social order was both displayed and reaffirmed, a performance of power and community that resonated far beyond the consumption of dishes. Through the feast, the castle projected stability, prosperity, and the permanence of the lord's authority. As the echoes of laughter, conversation, and the clinking of goblets faded with the conclusion of a feast, the castle's routine life resumed. Yet the memory of these grand gatherings lingered, shaping perceptions and relationships for days and weeks to come. The social significance of feasts was thus inseparable from their culinary dimension, each reinforcing the other in a delicate balance. From the importance of the feast, the story of medieval castle food moves toward the practical realities that underpinned these events. Beneath the surface of celebration lay the challenges of preservation and storage, the demands of supply, and the constant effort required to ensure that the right ingredients were on hand at the right time. These behind-the-scenes aspects shaped what could be served and sometimes led to unexpected or unusual culinary choices. The grand feasts and lavish banquets that defined life within medieval castles were remarkable displays of wealth and abundance, but they were supported by a far less glamorous reality: the daily challenge of preserving and storing food in an era before refrigeration and modern conveniences. This fundamental issue shaped not only what could be served at the castle table, but also influenced the strange and sometimes unexpected foods that found their way onto medieval plates. The methods of preservation and the limitations imposed by storage conditions dictated much about the culinary culture of the time. Castles, by their very nature, were fortified stone structures designed to withstand sieges and protect inhabitants from external threats. However, the thick walls, high towers, and narrow windows that made castles defensible also made them cold and damp. While these conditions offered some natural cooling in summer months, they presented significant challenges for the storage of perishable goods. Kitchens and pantries were often located in basements or separate buildings to minimize fire risk and smoke, but these spaces varied widely in temperature and humidity. Without refrigeration, medieval cooks relied on several traditional preservation techniques, each with its own advantages and limitations. Salting was among the most common methods. Salt draws moisture out of meat and fish, creating an environment hostile to bacterial growth. Large quantities of salted pork, beef, and fish were stored in barrels or wooden tubs, often buried in cool cellars to extend their shelf life. However, salted meat required soaking or boiling before consumption to remove excess salt, which influenced cooking methods and flavor profiles. Smoking was another widely used technique. Meats and fish were hung over smoldering fires in specially designed smokehouses or kitchen areas, where the combination of smoke and heat helped to cure and dry the food. This process imparted distinctive flavors, but also meant that smoky, sometimes harsh tastes became a regular part of medieval diets. The preservation of game, such as venison or wildfowl, often involved smoking to ensure it could last beyond the hunting season. Drying and air curing also played a role, especially for herbs, fruits, and some meats. Foods were hung or laid out in airy spaces, sometimes near hearths but protected from pests. Dried fruits, such as raisins or figs, were prized additions to both savory and sweet dishes, offering a concentrated sweetness that contrasted with the saltier or smokier flavors elsewhere on the table. Pickling, using vinegar or fermented liquids, was another preservation method, though less widespread due to the relative scarcity and expense of vinegar. Vegetables, and occasionally fruits, were preserved this way to provide some variation in the otherwise limited diet during winter months or fast days. Fermentation also produced foods like sauerkraut or sour beer, common staples that sustained many castle inhabitants. Despite these techniques, food preservation was never perfect. Spoilage was a constant threat, and food supplies had to be managed carefully to avoid waste. This precarious situation meant that cooks often had to use what was available quickly, resulting in recipes that incorporated older or less fresh ingredients in creative ways. Some dishes emerged precisely because of the need to mask or transform food that had begun to spoil, leading to unusual flavor combinations and textures. Storage facilities themselves were critical yet imperfect. Root cellars, cool underground chambers, and stone pantries provided relatively stable environments, but were vulnerable to moisture, pests, and contamination. The management of these spaces required skill and vigilance, often falling to specialized servants or stewards. Barrels, sacks, and ceramic jars were common containers, each with their own challenges in protecting contents from air and vermin. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life also influenced food storage and availability. Fresh meat and produce were abundant after hunts or harvests, but as winter set in, reliance on preserved foods increased sharply. This cycle created fluctuations in diet, where fresher, lighter dishes gave way to heavier, saltier, and often less appetizing fare. The preservation methods shaped not only the taste but also the texture and appearance of the food. The necessity of preserving food for long periods sometimes led to the inclusion of less commonly consumed parts of animals, such as offal or tougher cuts of meat, which could be salted or smoked alongside prime cuts. These ingredients were economical and reduced waste, but also contributed to the unusual and often unappealing dishes recorded in historical accounts. Additionally, the use of spices and strong flavorings helped mask any undesirable tastes arising from the preservation processes. Another consequence of preservation challenges was the reliance on staple foods that stored well, such as hard breads, dried legumes, and grains. These ingredients formed the backbone of many meals, and were often combined with limited amounts of preserved meat or fish to provide variety. The preparation of potages, thick, slowly cooked stews, allowed cooks to stretch limited ingredients into filling meals, incorporating whatever was available. Water supply and its quality also affected food preservation and preparation. Castles often relied on wells or nearby rivers, but water could be contaminated or limited, making brewing and fermenting not only a culinary choice but sometimes a necessity to avoid illness. Alcohol, mead, and wine were common drinks that complemented the food and aided digestion, further integrating preservation and consumption. These practical considerations of preservation and storage highlight the gap between the image of sumptuous medieval feasts and the realities of food supply in the castle. The ingenuity required to maintain provisions shaped not only what was served but how it was prepared and experienced. The smells of smoke, salt, and vinegar permeated the kitchens and dining halls alike, influencing the flavors and textures that defined medieval cuisine. Understanding these challenges also sheds light on why some foods considered unusual or strange today were commonplace in medieval castles. What might seem bizarre or unappetizing was often the product of necessity, tradition, and the limitations of the time. Preservation was a silent force behind the medieval menu, dictating the presence of salted hams, pickled fish, smoked game, and dense breads. As the demands of preservation influenced food choices and cooking methods, the reliance on local hunting became even more important to supplement these stored provisions. The seasonal availability of game and fish not only enriched the diet, but also introduced variety and prestige to the table. Hunting rights, reserved for the nobility, ensured access to fresh meat and contributed to the hierarchy of foods within the castle. From the challenges of preserving and storing food, the story moves naturally toward this role of hunting and game in the castle's culinary culture. A world where the chase was both practical and symbolic, supplying prized ingredients for the lord's table, and shaping the strange and varied dishes that characterized medieval castle life. In the intricate tapestry of medieval castle life, hunting was far more than a pastime or sport. It was a vital source of sustenance, status, and spectacle, intimately connected with the culinary traditions that shaped the castle's tables. The role of hunting and game in castle cuisine was deeply woven into the social, economic, and cultural fabric of the period. It supplied the lords and their households with prized meats that often contrasted sharply with the everyday fare of peasants and servants. Some game meats were considered luxurious delicacies, while others might strike modern sensibilities as bizarre or unappetizing. Together they painted a rich and complex picture of medieval eating habits. The right to hunt was carefully regulated in medieval society, reserved almost exclusively for the nobility and those granted special privileges. Forests and hunting grounds were often owned or controlled by the lord of the castle, who guarded these rights jealously. Hunting was not simply about procuring food, it was a ritual that reinforced power and social status. To successfully stalk and kill a stag, boar, or other game was a mark of skill and prestige, demonstrating a lord's dominion over the land and its creatures. The variety of game animals available depended on geography, season, and local laws, but a wide array of species might be hunted and brought to the castle table. Deer, particularly red and fallow deer, were among the most prized, their venison highly sought after for feasts and special occasions. Wild boar, with its strong flavor and tough meat, was also a common quarry, though less frequent than deer due to its aggressive nature and the difficulty of hunting it. Smaller game such as rabbits, hares, pheasants, partridges, and various waterfowl supplemented the diet, providing a range of flavors and textures. The meat from these animals was prized not only for its taste but also for its symbolic value. Venison, for instance, was associated with nobility and refinement, often served at banquets to impress guests and assert the host's wealth and connections. Recipes for preparing game meats varied widely, from roasting and boiling to complex pies and stews. The use of spices, sauces, and decorative presentations further elevated these dishes, transforming them into centerpieces of medieval feasts. Yet beyond the celebrated animals, medieval hunting also brought less conventional creatures into the kitchen. Swans and peacocks, both considered exotic and luxurious, were sometimes hunted or captured and served whole at banquets, their elaborate plumage occasionally incorporated into the presentation. These birds were valued as much for their dramatic visual impact as for their flavor, often displayed on the table as a sign of extravagance. Other game animals might seem unusual or even unsettling to modern eyes. Hedgehogs, for example, were eaten in some regions, often roasted and served in pies. The medieval palate was accustomed to a wider range of animals than contemporary tastes allow. The consumption of such creatures reflected not only availability, but also cultural preferences and symbolism. The use of these animals in cuisine could be tied to local customs, medicinal beliefs, or simply the necessity of utilizing all available resources. Hunting was a seasonal activity, and the availability of game meats fluctuated throughout the year. This seasonality influenced the menu in castles, with fresh game appearing on tables after successful hunts in autumn and winter, while preserved meats dominated in other seasons. The arrival of fresh venison or wildfowl was often celebrated and incorporated into special feasts, marking important moments in the castle calendar. The process of preparing game meat was an elaborate affair. Skilled cooks and kitchen staff were responsible for cleaning, butchering, and cooking these animals in ways that maximized flavor and minimized toughness. Techniques such as marinating, slow roasting, or cooking with spices helped to tenderize meats and enhance their taste. Sometimes, game was cooked in pies with layers of pastry designed both to preserve the meat and to create an impressive presentation. The symbolism of hunting extended beyond the table. It was a communal activity involving the lord, his retainers, and sometimes local villagers, each with defined roles and expectations. The hunt itself was a display of power over nature and a reinforcement of social hierarchies. Successful hunts not only supplied food but also stories, trophies, and social capital that reinforced the lord's prestige. Moreover, the hunting tradition influenced the culinary repertoire beyond the castle walls. Recipes for game dishes were recorded in medieval cookbooks, circulated among the aristocracy, and adapted by cooks in different regions. These texts offer insight into the flavors and preparations prized in the period, including the use of spices such as pepper, cloves, and cinnamon to complement game meats. However, the emphasis on game meats in castle cuisine had its contradictions. While lords enjoyed freshly hunted venison and boar, many of the castle's inhabitants consumed diets centered on grains, legumes, and preserved meats. The disparity between the luxurious foods served at the high table and the simpler fare below stairs highlighted the social stratification within the castle. Hunting rights also contributed to tensions between lords and peasants. Commoners were often prohibited from hunting on the lord's lands, with harsh penalties imposed for poaching. This legal restriction underscored the symbolic and economic importance of game meats and hunting privileges, making them a vital part of the feudal system. As game meats took center stage at medieval feasts, their presence shaped the character of the cuisine, introducing flavors and textures that differed markedly from domesticated animals. The interplay of freshness and preservation, abundance and scarcity, status and survival, all converged in the dishes that graced the castle table. Moving from the role of game and hunting in medieval cuisine, the story naturally unfolds toward the influence of exotic ingredients and spices. These luxury goods, brought from distant lands, added complexity and rarity to dishes, further emphasizing the wealth and reach of the castle's lord. Within the stone walls of medieval castles, the presence of food carried a deeper significance than mere nourishment or local tradition. Among the many elements that made castle feasts extraordinary, the use of exotic ingredients and spices stood out as symbols of wealth, global connection, and sometimes culinary strangeness. These rare commodities, imported from distant lands along complex trade routes, transformed familiar dishes into extravagant fare, infusing medieval cuisine with flavors both intriguing and, to modern sensibilities, occasionally peculiar. The medieval period was marked by expanding networks of commerce that linked Europe with regions as far away as the Middle East, India, and even parts of Asia. Through a series of intermediaries, merchants, traders, and caravans, luxury goods, including spices, sugar, and other unusual ingredients, made their way into the great halls of Europe's nobility. The sheer cost and rarity of these items elevated their status, making them prized possessions in any noble's pantry and essential features of high-status dining. Among the most coveted spices were pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and saffron. Pepper, often called black gold, was especially prized for its pungent heat and ability to enhance or mask the flavors of preserved meats. Cinnamon and cloves added warmth and sweetness, while saffron contributed a distinctive golden hue and subtle aroma to dishes. Nutmeg, imported primarily from the Spice Islands, was rare and expensive, used sparingly to lend a mysterious edge to sauces and pies. The introduction of these spices to European kitchens changed not only the taste but the appearance and texture of food. Recipes from medieval cookbooks often call for lavish use of these spices, creating complex flavor profiles that could be both surprising and intense. The combination of sweet and savory, commonplace in medieval cuisine, was often heightened by the inclusion of spices, resulting in dishes where meats were accompanied by fruits, sugar, and aromatic seasonings. Sugar, too, played a unique role. Unlike today, when sugar is ubiquitous and cheap, medieval sugar was a luxury item imported from plantations in the Mediterranean, and later from the Levant. It was often used not only to sweeten desserts, but also to balance the flavors of savory dishes. Its crystalline form could also be molded into decorative shapes, contributing to the theatrical presentation of food. Alongside spices, other exotic ingredients entered the medieval kitchen. Almonds and other nuts were widely used, either ground into sauces like almond milk or marzipan, or incorporated whole into dishes. Dried fruits such as raisins, currants, and dates offered sweetness and texture. The use of rosewater and other floral waters, imported from the Middle East, introduced fragrant notes that are now rare in Western cooking, but were common then. Yet the presence of these exotic ingredients also created some culinary oddities. To the modern palate, the mixing of sweet spices with meat or fish, the heavy use of sugar in savory dishes, and the blending of intense aromas may seem strange or even unappetizing. However, in the context of medieval tastes and the symbolic importance of these spices, such combinations were highly prized. The use of spices was not purely about flavor, but also carried social and symbolic meaning. Their rarity and expense meant that their presence on the table was a direct signal of wealth and sophistication. To sprinkle cinnamon or saffron on a dish, was to demonstrate the Lord's connections to far-flung trade networks and his ability to afford luxury. In some cases, the inclusion of these ingredients was also believed to have medicinal properties, linked to prevailing theories of health and the balance of humors. The acquisition of spices was itself an indication of power. Merchants who could secure shipments of pepper or cloves facilitated the flow of these goods into Europe, but the nobles who purchased them wielded influence by displaying such rarities in their feasts. The demand for these ingredients helped to fuel exploration and eventually played a role in the Age of Discovery, but in the medieval period, they were precious commodities. These spices and exotic ingredients also influenced the types of dishes prepared. Pies filled with game or fish might be heavily spiced and sweetened, while sauces would blend vinegar, honey and spices into complex accompaniments. Meat might be paired with fruits like pears or quinces, creating a contrast that modern diners rarely encounter. The boundaries between sweet and savory were blurred, and the overall effect was often rich and intense. While the use of exotic spices and ingredients was mostly confined to the upper echelons of medieval society, their presence trickled down over time. As spices became more available and trade routes stabilized, their use spread gradually into the diets of the wealthy merchant class, and to a lesser extent, lower ranks. However, the bulk of the population continued to rely on local simple flavors for much longer. The heavy reliance on these imported ingredients also exposed medieval culinary culture to the fluctuations of international trade. Political conflicts, piracy, and changing alliances could disrupt the supply of spices, affecting the availability and price of these luxury items. Such instability made the use of exotic spices a marker not only of status but also of economic resilience. In summary, the exotic ingredients and spices that found their way into medieval castle kitchens were more than mere flavorings. They were statements of power, wealth, and connection to a broader world. Their presence transformed dishes, making them strange or extravagant to modern eyes, but deeply meaningful in their original context. The culinary boldness of combining sweet, savory, pungent, and aromatic elements defined much of the cuisine served at feasts, contributing to the distinct character of medieval food. From the world of spices and exotic ingredients, the narrative flows naturally toward the special role of fish and seafood in medieval castle diets. Influenced by religious practices and availability, fish brought another layer of complexity and peculiarity to the medieval palate. The culinary world of medieval castles was shaped not only by social hierarchies and exotic imports, but also by deeply ingrained religious customs that influenced what could be eaten and when. Among these customs, the rules governing fasting and abstinence had a profound impact on the prominence of fish in the medieval diet, particularly in castles where adherence to church mandates was closely observed. This religious framework elevated fish to a central position on the table, introducing a variety of species and preparations that may seem unusual or mysterious to modern sensibilities. Medieval Christianity prescribed numerous fast days throughout the calendar year, especially during Lent and on Fridays when the consumption of meat was forbidden. Fish, however, was classified differently, considered an acceptable alternative that complied with the dietary restrictions of these observances. The Church's influence extended deeply into everyday life, dictating not only spiritual conduct but also shaping practical habits such as eating. In this way, fish became more than sustenance; it was a marker of piety and religious compliance. As a result, castles maintained a steady supply of fish year-round, utilizing nearby rivers, lakes and coastal waters, as well as preserved varieties brought in from farther afield. The importance of fish created a demand for a wide array of species, many of which might seem unfamiliar or even unappealing to contemporary diners. Freshwater fish such as pike, carp and tench were common, while saltwater species like cod, herring and sole also found their way onto the noble's table. Preservation played a crucial role here as well, as fresh fish was perishable and seasonal. Salting and smoking fish allowed castles to store these vital protein sources for use throughout the year, especially during fasting periods. Salted cod, known as stockfish, was a staple, traded extensively across Europe. This dried and salted fish had a firm texture and strong flavor, requiring careful preparation before consumption. It was often soaked for days to remove excess salt, then boiled, fried, or incorporated into stews. The variety of fish dishes was vast and inventive. Fish could be served boiled with herbs and spices, fried in oil or fat, baked in pies, or shaped into forcemeats and patties. Sauces made with vinegar, almond milk, or sweeteners accompanied fish, echoing the broader medieval tendency to blend sweet and savory flavors. The texture and taste of fish were often transformed by these preparations, creating dishes that balance subtlety with intensity. Certain fish held symbolic and cultural significance. The pike, with its fierce appearance and sharp teeth, was sometimes associated with strength and resilience, while the carp was valued for its size and adaptability. Religious symbolism also imbued fish with special status, as the fish was an early Christian symbol, representing faith and baptism. Thus, the presence of fish on the table during fast days resonated with spiritual meaning beyond mere compliance. However, the emphasis on fish also led to the consumption of species and preparations that modern palates might find challenging. Lampreys, eel-like jawless fish with a suction-cup mouth, were considered a delicacy in some courts despite their unusual appearance and texture. They were often roasted or boiled in rich sauces, prized for their rarity and flavor. Similarly, sea urchins, oysters, and other shellfish, while not as common in inland castles, appeared at coastal strongholds and added variety to the fish offerings. The reliance on fish during fast days and other religious observances contributed to the culinary oddities recorded in medieval manuscripts and accounts. The blending of fish with spices, sweeteners, and thick sauces sometimes produced combinations that modern diners might describe as strange or heavy. Yet, these dishes fulfilled a dual role of satisfying the body, while adhering to the spiritual discipline imposed by the church. The supply chain for fish was carefully managed within the castle economy. Fresh fish was often delivered daily during seasons when available, while preserved fish was stored in cool pantries or cellars. Monastic communities, with their strict adherence to fasting rules, were significant consumers and producers of fish dishes, influencing castle kitchens through their culinary practices and recipe transmission. The prominence of fish also reflected environmental and economic factors. In regions where game or fresh meat was less accessible, fish provided a reliable and sometimes more affordable protein source. The medieval diet, shaped by these complex forces, incorporated fish as a staple in ways that balanced religious obligation, availability, and culinary preference. As the medieval culinary narrative moves forward, the attention shifts from fish to the various types of bread and staple grains that formed the foundation of most meals. These humble foods, often overshadowed by the spectacle of meat and fish, were nonetheless essential, and exhibited their own peculiarities and cultural importance. In the rhythm of medieval castle life, alongside the occasional abundance of fish, game, and exotic spices, there remained a constant, dependable presence that formed the very backbone of sustenance: bread and grains. While the dishes of roasted venison, salted fish, and richly spiced pies often captured the imagination and symbolized status and celebration, it was the humble loaf of bread and the staple grains that quietly sustained the daily existence of all inhabitants, from lord to servant. This foundational foodstuff was as essential to medieval dining as the great feasts were to its ceremonies. Bread was the principal food of the medieval diet, and was consumed at every meal, often in large quantities. Its ubiquity stemmed from the importance of cereal crops, particularly wheat, rye, barley, and oats, which were cultivated extensively across the lands surrounding the castle. These grains formed the raw material for a variety of breads, porridges, and pottages that made up the everyday fare of castle residents and peasants alike. The type of bread eaten varied considerably according to social status and regional availability. Nobles typically enjoyed white bread made from finely milled wheat flour, known as manchet, or courtesy bread, which was soft, light, and prized for its delicate texture and appearance. This bread was a symbol of refinement and privilege, often served at the high table alongside the more elaborate dishes. Its whiteness and quality distinguished it from the darker, coarser breads eaten by lower classes. In contrast, Servants, laborers and peasants frequently ate bread made from rye, barley or mixed grains, which produced darker, denser loaves known as maslin, or black bread. This bread was tougher and more filling, often enriched with bran and other husks, giving it a stronger flavor and a heavier texture. Though less esteemed, this type of bread was vital for sustaining those engaged in physical labor, providing much-needed energy throughout the day. Bread was more than a mere side dish. It played multiple roles in medieval dining. It was used as a utensil, a platform for other foods, or a container for stews and sauces. The term trencher referred to a slice or piece of bread used to hold or scoop up food. After a meal, these bread trenchers, soaked with the juices of meat and sauce, might be eaten or given to the poor as alms. This practice reflects the integration of bread into social and religious customs within the castle community. The production of bread was a complex process involving several stages: grain harvesting, milling, kneading, proofing, and baking. Milling was often done at local mills powered by water or wind, converting harvested grain into flour of varying fineness. Baking typically took place in large stone ovens within or near the castle, operated by skilled bakers who managed the precise timing and temperature needed to produce consistent loaves. These bakers held important roles within the castle's household, responsible not only for daily bread, but also for special ceremonial loaves baked for feasts. Grains also formed the basis for porridge and potages, thick, nourishing dishes that were eaten regularly by all classes. These dishes were prepared by boiling grains with water or broth, and often mixed with vegetables, herbs, and small amounts of meat or fish. Porridge was a staple especially for those who could not afford the variety or luxury of the noble table, sustaining many through long working days. The slow cooking process allowed even coarse grains to soften, making them easier to digest. Barley and oats were particularly important in the diets of the lower classes. Barley, less nutritious but hardy and adaptable to poor soils, was widely cultivated and used in breads and brews. Oats were common in northern and upland regions. Used similarly, the availability and quality of grain fluctuated with the seasons and harvest yields, sometimes leading to shortages and food insecurity. Grain was also the raw material for beer and ale, common beverages within the castle. These drinks were safer to consume than often contaminated water sources, and provided calories as well as hydration. Brewing was a crucial domestic industry, with alewives and brewers playing essential roles in castle life. The fermentation of grain introduced another dimension to medieval nutrition and social life, often accompanying meals or communal gatherings. The reliance on bread and grains reflected the practical realities of medieval agriculture and economy. While meats and fish were valued for their flavor and symbolism, they were not daily staples for most inhabitants. Instead, grains offered reliable sustenance that could be stored and preserved for extended periods, essential in a world where seasons dictated food availability. Interestingly, bread and grain-based foods also carried symbolic and religious weight. Bread was central to Christian ritual, most notably in the Eucharist, and this spiritual significance permeated everyday life. The breaking and sharing of bread symbolized community, charity and faith, reinforcing social bonds within the castle and beyond. From the simple loaves and porridges that underpinned daily nutrition, medieval cuisine expanded outward into more elaborate fare. Yet, it was always the grains and bread that provided the stable foundation beneath the ever-changing array of dishes. Their humble presence sustained not only bodies but also the social and religious fabric of castle life. As the story of medieval food continues, we turn to a strikingly practical and resourceful aspect of castle cooking: the use of offal and unusual animal parts. Teeth. This nose-to-tail approach minimized waste and added variety, introducing flavors and textures that might appear strange to modern diners but were vital to the economy and culture of the time. In the world of medieval castle cuisine, the blending of sweet and savory flavors was not simply a culinary choice, but a defining characteristic of the period's palate. Unlike the modern tendency to separate sweet desserts from savory main courses, medieval cooks frequently combined sugar, honey and spices with meats, fish and vegetables, creating dishes that might seem curious or even unsettling to contemporary tastes. This intertwining of sweet and savory was a hallmark of noble dining, shaped by cultural influences, ingredient availability, and evolving gastronomic traditions. The medieval fascination with sweet and savory combinations can be traced to several factors. Firstly, the increasing availability of sugar and exotic sweeteners such as honey introduced new dimensions to flavor profiles. Though sugar was a costly import from Mediterranean plantations and later the Levant, it became a symbol of wealth and sophistication, used liberally in the kitchens of castles for both culinary and decorative purposes. Honey, more accessible but still prized, had long been a staple sweetener in Europe, lending its floral notes to dishes both humble and grand. Secondly, the use of spices, many of which carried both aromatic and sweet qualities, amplified this blending. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and mace were used not only in desserts but also in sauces and marinades for meats and fish. Their warmth and complexity complemented the savory elements, producing a layered taste experience that balanced richness, sweetness, and pungency. Dishes that combined sweet and savory elements were particularly prevalent in pies and tarts, which could encase game meats, fish, or poultry alongside fruits such as raisins, dates, or pears. These pies often featured elaborate crusts and fillings, richly seasoned with spices and sweeteners, serving as both sustenance and spectacle during feasts. The blending of meat and fruit may seem unusual now, but it was an accepted and celebrated technique in medieval kitchens. One notable example is the meat tart, a dish that might contain chopped or minced game meats, mixed with dried fruits and spiced with pepper, cinnamon, and cloves. These tarts were often served hot, the contrast of sweet and savory flavors creating a distinct profile. Similarly, roast meats were sometimes glazed or accompanied by sauces thickened with sugar and flavored with vinegar, combining tang, sweetness, and richness. The use of sweet and savory extended beyond pies and sauces to stews and soups, where dried fruits and honey could be added to broth-based dishes. These preparations allowed cooks to utilize available ingredients creatively, blending flavors that reflected both local produce and imported luxuries. The resulting dishes could be hearty and complex, with sweetness offsetting the saltiness or bitterness of other components. This flavor blending also had social and symbolic significance. The use of expensive sweeteners and spices underscored the host's wealth and access to luxury goods. Serving dishes that melded sweet and savory was a culinary display, marking the sophistication and status of the noble household. It demonstrated knowledge of fashionable tastes, as well as the ability to indulge in expensive ingredients that were beyond the reach of common folk. Medieval cookery texts and recipe collections such as the Formy of Curie compiled by the English royal cooks in the late 14th century provide insight into these practices. Recipes instruct the combination of meat with sugar and spices, illustrating that such blends were both deliberate and refined. The popularity of these recipes across Europe suggests a shared aristocratic culinary culture that prized complexity and contrast in flavor. To modern diners, accustomed to clear boundaries between sweet and savory, these medieval dishes can appear strange or challenging. The modern palate often expects desserts to be distinct from main courses, and the mixing of fruit with meat may seem unbalanced. Yet, in the medieval context, these combinations were harmonious and highly regarded. The persistence of sweet and savory blends also relates to medieval theories of health and humoral balance. Foods were classified by qualities such as hot, cold, moist, or dry, and combining sweet and savory ingredients was believed to balance these properties, contributing to overall well-being. The complexity of flavors reflected broader ideas about harmony and balance in the body and diet. Moreover, these flavor combinations contributed to the sensory experience of medieval feasts, engaging guests not only through taste but through aroma, appearance, and texture. The interplay of soft fruits with tender meats, the contrast of sweet honey with pungent spices, and the richness of sauces created a multi-sensory meal that was as much about impression as consumption. As the culinary narrative of medieval castles progresses, attention turns to another fascinating aspect of the diet, the use of offal and unusual animal parts. These ingredients, often overlooked today, were essential components of medieval cooking, reflecting a practical nose-to-tail philosophy that maximized resources and introduced further variety into the castle kitchen. In the medieval castle, food was only part of the culinary experience. The drinks served alongside meals played an equally vital role in shaping the sensory landscape of the table. The beverages consumed within these stone walls were as varied and sometimes as curious as the dishes themselves. From fermented honey-based meads to richly spiced wines like Hippocrates, medieval drinks reveal a world where flavors, preservation techniques, and social customs combined to create an assortment of libations that might seem surprising or even strange to modern palates. Water, the most basic of drinks, was seldom trusted in medieval times due to its frequent contamination. Wells and rivers could harbor disease, making untreated water a risky choice. As a result, most inhabitants of castles, from nobles to servants, turned to alcoholic beverages not just for pleasure, but for safety and sustenance. These drinks provided hydration, calories, and often a mild inebriation that eased the hardships of daily life. Among the most common medieval drinks was ale, a fermented brew made primarily from barley or other grains. Ale was brewed locally within the castle or nearby villages, and consumed daily by almost everyone, including children. Its alcohol content was relatively low compared to modern beers, but it was a reliable source of nutrition and safe hydration. The process of brewing ale was an art in itself, with master brewers carefully balancing ingredients, fermentation times and temperatures to produce consistent results. Beer, distinguished by the use of hops, became more widespread in later medieval periods, valued for its longer shelf life and bitter flavor. Yet, in many castles, traditional ales persisted alongside or instead of beer. These fermented grain beverages often varied in strength and flavor, reflecting local resources and brewing traditions. Wine occupied a different place in the medieval drink hierarchy. Imported from southern Europe, particularly France, Italy and Spain, wine was a mark of status and refinement. It was typically consumed by the nobility and their guests, served in ornate goblets during feasts and ceremonies. The quality and price of wine varied widely, with the finest vintages reserved for high occasions. One of the most fascinating and distinctive medieval drinks was Hippocrates, a type of spiced wine named after the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates. Hippocrates was made by infusing red or white wine with a blend of spices such as cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and sometimes sugar or honey. The mixture was then filtered through a cloth known as a Hippocratic sleeve, giving the beverage its name. This spiced wine was prized for its warmth, sweetness and medicinal qualities, often served at the end of a meal to aid digestion and comfort guests. Mead, a fermented honey beverage, was also popular, especially in northern and Anglo-Saxon influenced regions. Made by fermenting honey with water, sometimes flavored with herbs or spices, mead offered a sweet and potent alternative to grain-based drinks. It was associated with festive occasions and mythic traditions, often mentioned in literature and folklore as a drink of kings and heroes. Other beverages included cider, made from fermented apples, which was common in regions where apples thrived. Fruit wines, derived from berries or other fruits, appeared occasionally, but were less widespread. Additionally, various herbal infusions and decoctions were consumed, sometimes for medicinal purposes or to complement meals. The taste profiles of these medieval drinks would likely surprise modern drinkers. The prevalence of spices, sweeteners, and sometimes smoky or sour notes created complex flavors. Sweetness was often more prominent than in contemporary alcoholic beverages, as sugar and honey were used not only to sweeten, but also to mask harsh or off flavors resulting from preservation or fermentation methods. The ritual of drinking in castles was tightly woven into social customs. Toasting was common, symbolizing goodwill, loyalty, or celebration. The sharing of cups and communal drinking vessels underscored bonds between guests and hosts. Large goblets and drinking horns added pageantry to the act, enhancing the spectacle of feasting. Alcohol also played a practical role in medieval health beliefs. It was thought to warm the body, aid digestion, and ward off illness. The use of spiced and sweetened wines like hippocras was closely linked to these medicinal ideas, with recipes often doubling as remedies. This interplay between drink and medicine blurred the lines of consumption, reflecting broader medieval concepts of diet and well-being. Storage and serving of beverages presented their own challenges. Wine was stored in barrels or amphorae, with careful attention to prevent spoilage. Ale and mead were brewed in large vats and served fresh, sometimes from wooden casks. The skill of cellars and brewmasters was crucial in maintaining quality, as well as in timing the production to meet feasts and daily needs. The intoxicating effects of these beverages also influenced castle life beyond the dining hall. Alcohol consumption could lubricate conversation, encourage merriment, and mark celebrations, but excess carried risks of disorder and illness. Regulations around drinking, including limits on the sale and consumption of alcohol, were enforced in many communities to maintain order. In some, the strange and varied beverages of medieval castles formed an essential complement to the food, enhancing social rituals, providing nourishment and refreshment, and contributing to the complex sensory experience of medieval dining. From the humble ale to the exotic hippocras, these drinks reflected a world where flavor, tradition, and practicality intertwined. The story of medieval castle cuisine now turns naturally toward another intriguing aspect: the use of offal and unusual animal parts. These ingredients, often overlooked today, were vital components of the medieval kitchen, showcasing a resourceful and comprehensive approach to animal consumption. The culinary landscape of medieval castles was not shaped solely by the pursuits of nobility or the innovations of courtly chefs. A profound influence often traced its roots to the quiet, contemplative world of monasteries and religious communities. Monks and monastic kitchens played a pivotal role in culinary innovation, introducing unique recipes and food preparation techniques that resonated within castle walls, sometimes surprising modern observers with their creativity and occasionally peculiarity. Monastic communities across medieval Europe were centers of learning, preservation, and experimentation. Within their walls, monks meticulously copied manuscripts, studied natural sciences, and developed agricultural practices. Food production and preparation were integral to monastic life, not merely for sustenance but as acts of discipline, charity, and spiritual reflection. The monastery's kitchen was both practical and symbolic, shaping the diets of monks themselves and influencing the broader culinary culture of the surrounding regions. One of the key factors that distinguished monastic culinary contributions was the strict adherence to religious dietary rules, including fasting and abstinence periods. Many monks were bound by vows requiring them to abstain from meat on certain days or throughout specific seasons. This necessity prompted the development of creative vegetarian dishes and innovative uses of fish, grains, herbs, and legumes. Recipes emerging from monastic kitchens often showcased resourcefulness, maximizing flavor and nutrition within these constraints. The cultivation of herbs and medicinal plants in monastic gardens greatly impacted culinary practices. Monks cultivated rosemary, sage, thyme, parsley, and many other herbs, integrating these into their cooking to enhance taste and preserve food. These aromatic plants not only added depth to dishes, but also reflected the medieval understanding of food as medicine, with herbs believed to balance humors and promote health. Monasteries were also among the earliest European centers for the production of cheese, beer, and wine. The careful crafting of these staples contributed to their refinement and widespread adoption. Monastic breweries in particular became renowned for producing high-quality ales and beers, often experimenting with fermentation and storage techniques. This expertise influenced castle brewing, with many noble households sourcing their beverages from nearby abbeys or adopting monastic methods. One of the most significant culinary contributions of monks was the compilation and preservation of recipes. Monastic scribes copied not only religious texts but also cookbooks and culinary treatises, safeguarding knowledge that might have otherwise been lost. Manuscripts such as the Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum and other medieval texts circulated widely, blending medical advice with cooking instructions and reflecting monastic expertise. Monastic recipes sometimes included unusual or rare ingredients and preparations that may seem eccentric today. For example, some monks experimented with fermented foods, pickling vegetables and even fruits to extend their shelf life and diversify flavors. The use of pulse crops like lentils, beans and chickpeas was common, leading to richly textured stews and porridges seasoned with herbs and spices. Certain dishes bore religious symbolism, connecting the act of eating to spiritual contemplation. Bread baked with special care, honeyed confections and spiced wines like hippocras, whose recipe monks helped to refine, embodied both nourishment and ritual. These foods often accompanied religious festivals, fasting periods and communal meals, imbuing them with layers of meaning beyond taste. The influence of monasteries also extended to the wider economy of medieval food production. Monastic estates managed large tracts of land, employing agricultural innovations that improved grain yields and livestock breeding. Their surplus production often supported surrounding communities, and even supplied castles with high-quality foodstuffs. While many monastic culinary practices were absorbed into noble kitchens, some remained distinct, reflecting the contemplative and disciplined nature of monastic life. The simplicity of certain dishes, the emphasis on preservation, and the integration of medicinal knowledge created a culinary tradition that balanced austerity with creativity. In some cases, monasteries served as repositories for culinary experimentation that would later find their way into castle feasts. The refined use of spices, the balance of sweet and savory, and the preparation of complex pies and pastries can trace lineages to monastic cooks and their manuscripts. This legacy enriched the diversity of medieval cuisine and introduced nuances that elevated food from mere sustenance to art. Thus, the role of monks and monasteries in culinary innovation was multifaceted and profound. Through their gardening, brewing, cooking and manuscript preservation, religious communities shaped the tastes and techniques of medieval castle kitchens, leaving a lasting imprint on the history of food. As the story of medieval food continues, it naturally leads us to consider the strange and often macabre punishments related to food theft and consumption, revealing a harsher side of the castle's relationship with sustenance and survival. Medieval castles were not merely fortresses of stone and battlements, they were bustling centers of domestic activity, with kitchens that functioned as vital hubs of daily life. Behind every lavish feast or simple meal lay the tireless work of cooks and kitchen staff, whose expertise and labor brought to life the often complex and sometimes strange dishes characteristic of castle cuisine. Understanding the preparation of food in these kitchens provides insight into the rhythms of medieval dining and the practical realities that shaped the fare served at noble tables. Castle kitchens were typically large, multi-room spaces designed to accommodate the extensive and varied food production required for the household. They included areas for roasting, boiling, baking, and preserving food, as well as storage rooms for ingredients and utensils. The architecture and layout of these kitchens reflected both functional needs and concerns about fire hazards, smoke, and sanitation. Massive hearths dominated the cooking areas, where spits turned over open flames and large cauldrons bubbled with stews. The kitchen staff was organized hierarchically, mirroring the broader social structures of the castle. At the top was the master cook or head chef, often a skilled and experienced individual responsible for planning menus, overseeing food preparation, and managing the kitchen workforce. Beneath the master cook were various specialized roles: bakers, scullery workers, butchers, pastry cooks, and assistants, each tasked with particular duties. Many cooks were trained through apprenticeships and passed down culinary knowledge through generations. Their skills encompassed a wide range of techniques, including roasting large joints of meat on spits, boiling and poaching fish, baking bread and pies, and preparing sauces and spice blends. The cooking process was labor-intensive and time-consuming, requiring careful coordination to ensure that dishes were ready simultaneously and presented appropriately. Food preparation involved a series of steps that might seem elaborate or unfamiliar today. For instance, meat was often salted or smoked to preserve it, then soaked or boiled before roasting to tenderize the flesh and reduce saltiness. Sauces were made from reductions of wine, vinegar, and broth, thickened with ground almonds or breadcrumbs, and seasoned with a mixture of herbs and spices. The blending of sweet and savory flavors, characteristic of medieval cuisine, demanded precise timing and ingredient management. The production of pies and pastries was particularly complex. These dishes often contained multiple layers of meat, fruit, and spices encased in thick, sturdy crusts, designed not just for eating, but also for transportation and storage. The preparation of such pies required skilled pastry cooks and considerable time to assemble and bake properly. Cooking technologies and equipment influenced the nature of food preparation. The open hearth was central, but ovens for baking bread and pastries, cauldrons for boiling, and spits for roasting shaped the variety of techniques available. Tools such as knives, grinders, and sieves facilitated the processing of ingredients. The availability of these technologies varied among castles, with wealthier households possessing more advanced and specialized equipment. Sanitation and food safety were significant concerns, though understood differently than today. Kitchens had to manage smoke and heat, rodents and contamination risks, all within the constraints of medieval knowledge and resources. Despite these challenges, cooks maintained standards that ensured food was safe and palatable for consumption. The timing and scale of cooking operations were dictated by the castle's calendar of meals, feasts, and events. Daily meals varied from modest fare for servants to elaborate banquets for nobles and guests. Special occasions demanded exceptional culinary efforts, with menus featuring rare ingredients, complex dishes, and impressive presentations. In addition to preparing food, cooks were often involved in managing supplies, overseeing preservation techniques such as salting, smoking, and pickling, and coordinating with hunters, bakers, and gardeners to ensure a steady flow of ingredients. This interconnected network reflected the castle's broader economic and social system. Despite the grandeur associated with castle cuisine, the kitchen was a place of hard work, constant activity, and sometimes chaos. The preparation of meals required skill, patience, and organization, with cooks adapting to seasonal changes, ingredient availability, and the preferences of their lords. In sum, the medieval castle kitchen was a dynamic environment where culinary artistry met practical necessity. The people who worked there shaped the food culture of the era, turning raw materials into the strange, rich, and varied dishes that defined castle dining. From the intense activity of the kitchens, the story now turns to the elaborate rituals of feasting and dining itself, where food took on symbolic meaning and social function within the walls of the castle. In medieval castles, the experience of food extended far beyond mere nourishment. The presentation and display of dishes were integral to the spectacle of feasting, where the visual impact of a meal often rivaled or even surpassed its taste. Elaborate, theatrical food displays transformed the dining hall into a stage, crafting an atmosphere of wonder and awe for guests. These presentations, sometimes bizarre and surprising, served to impress visitors, demonstrate the host's wealth and sophistication, and reinforce social hierarchies. The medieval banquet was a carefully choreographed event. The arrival of each dish was anticipated with ceremony, and the food itself became a form of entertainment. Cooks and servants prepared and presented meals with meticulous attention to appearance, employing a range of techniques to create stunning and sometimes bewildering effects. The dining hall was decorated accordingly, with tapestries, banners, and fine tableware complementing the culinary artistry. One of the most distinctive elements of medieval food presentation was the use of subtleties or entremets, ornamental dishes that often took the form of elaborate sculptures or symbolic figures. These creations were designed to captivate guests visually and intellectually, combining artistry with culinary skill. Made from sugar, marzipan, pastry, or even cooked meats and fish, subtleties could depict animals, castles, ships, or mythological scenes. The construction of such displays required skilled artisans who blended cooking with carving and design. For example, a swan might be carved from a cooked bird and adorned with herbs or gold leaf, placed atop a pie or platter as a centerpiece. Another common spectacle was the cockatrice, a mythical creature combining parts of different animals, fashioned from poultry or pastry. These fanciful creations symbolized the host's creativity and resources. Colors and textures were carefully considered in presentation. Dishes were garnished with edible flowers, fruits, and herbs, adding visual contrast. The use of bright spices like saffron imparted golden hues to sauces and rice, enhancing their appeal. Sauces were often poured tableside, creating a dynamic effect as rich liquids dripped over meats and breads. In addition to static displays, medieval banquets featured moving or surprising food presentations. Some castles staged surprise dishes, where food was hidden within other dishes, or unexpected animals were served. At times live animals such as birds were released from pies, thrilling guests with theatrical flair. These spectacles demonstrated not only culinary skill but also a flair for drama and showmanship. The dining table itself was arranged to highlight social status, with the lord and distinguished guests seated at the high table, enjoying the finest and most artistically presented dishes. Lower-ranking individuals received simpler fare, reflecting the strict hierarchy embedded in medieval society. The arrangement of dishes and the order of serving reinforced these distinctions, with presentation acting as a visual language of power and privilege. Food presentation also intertwined with symbolic meaning. Certain dishes and decorations were chosen to convey messages, celebrate events, or honor guests. For example, edible heraldic devices displayed family crests or alliances. The choice of colors and ingredients might reflect seasonal festivals or religious observances. In this way, food became a medium for storytelling and communication. The production of such elaborate food displays was labor-intensive and costly, accessible only to the wealthiest households. It required close collaboration between cooks, kitchen staff, and entertainers, highlighting the multidisciplinary nature of medieval feasting culture. The investment in presentation underscored the importance of hospitality and reputation in noble circles. While the tastes of these dishes might have been unusual or challenging to modern palates, blending sweet and savory flavors, or incorporating ingredients now considered exotic, the visual impact was undeniable. The theatricality of food presentation transformed dining into an immersive experience that engaged guests on multiple sensory levels. As the feast drew to a close, the after-meal entertainments often included music, poetry, or dancing, extending the celebration and reinforcing social bonds. In this context, the artful presentation of food was part of a broader tapestry of cultural expression within the castle. From the spectacle of theatrical food displays, the journey through medieval castle cuisine moves toward an exploration of the food consumed by those at the lower end of the social spectrum. The servants, laborers, and lesser inhabitants whose diet, though simpler, was shaped by its own set of customs and constraints. In the medieval castle, food was seldom regarded solely as a source of nourishment or pleasure. Its role extended deeply into the realms of health and healing, reflecting a worldview in which diet and medicine were intricately intertwined. The intersection of food and medicine within castle walls was a domain where culinary practices were guided not only by taste or sustenance, but by the belief that certain dishes could restore balance, alleviate ailments, and promote well-being. This fusion of gastronomy and healing gave rise to a variety of medicinal foods and culinary remedies, often served with more concern for their health benefits than for their flavor. Medieval medicine was profoundly influenced by the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, each associated with particular qualities such as hot, cold, moist, or dry. Health was perceived as the harmonious balance of these humours, and illness was the result of their imbalance. Food was understood to possess inherent qualities that could affect this balance. Thus, the choice and preparation of food within the castle kitchen were often dictated by its supposed ability to modify humoral conditions. Certain foods were classified according to their temperament: warming or cooling, moistening or drying. For example, garlic and onions were considered warming and stimulating, used to invigorate the body, while cucumbers and lettuces were cooling and employed to soothe excess heat. Spices such as cinnamon, ginger, and pepper were prized not only for flavor but for their medicinal properties, believed to improve digestion and circulation. Castle kitchens, often in consultation with court physicians or apothecaries, prepared specific dishes intended to address common ailments or maintain health. Broths and soups were among the most frequently prescribed forms, prized for their ease of digestion and restorative qualities. Chicken broth, often infused with herbs like parsley and sage, was a staple remedy for weakness or fever. Honey, a ubiquitous ingredient in medieval cooking, was esteemed for its antiseptic and healing properties. It was used in a variety of medicinal preparations, from soothing sore throats to dressing wounds. Its incorporation into both food and drink highlighted the seamless blend of culinary and therapeutic purposes. Another common medicinal food was pottage, a thick stew made from grains, legumes, and vegetables. Depending on the ingredients, pottage could be tailored to meet the needs of particular humoral imbalances. For instance, a pottage rich in beans and onions might be used to warm the body, while one heavy with cooling herbs could calm inflammation. Special dietary regimens were sometimes prescribed for nobles recovering from illness or surgery. These diets emphasized easily digestible foods, moderation, and the avoidance of excess richness or heaviness. Delicate dishes such as almond milk-based custards, soft-boiled eggs, or rice puddings were prepared with these considerations in mind. The preparation of medicinal foods also reflected an awareness of seasonality and environment. Certain herbs and vegetables were harvested at specific times to maximize their potency, and recipes often called for freshly prepared ingredients rather than stored or preserved foods, believed to retain greater therapeutic value. In some cases, food was administered as part of ritualized healing practices. The sharing of special dishes at particular times or during religious ceremonies was thought to confer blessings or protection. The symbolic nature of such foods reinforced their perceived efficacy, weaving together spiritual and physical health. The overlap between food and medicine extended to the use of spiced wines and fortified beverages, such as hippocras, which were consumed not only for pleasure but as digestive aids and tonics. These drinks, enriched with aromatic herbs and sweeteners, epitomized the medieval approach to healing through diet. The culinary remedies of the medieval castle, while grounded in the medical theories of their time, sometimes involved ingredients and combinations that might seem peculiar or unappetizing to modern sensibilities. Yet, they represent a holistic approach to health, where food was as much a tool for healing as a source of enjoyment. As the narrative of medieval castle cuisine advances, the next point will explore the significant role that monks and monasteries played in culinary innovation, influencing not only medicinal foods but a broader range of recipes that enriched castle kitchens with their unique knowledge and traditions. In medieval castles, the rhythm of life was deeply intertwined with the cycles of nature and the demands of religious observance. The passing of seasons and the dictates of the ecclesiastical calendar shaped every aspect of existence, not least the food that was grown, prepared and consumed within castle walls. The menus served at noble tables were far from arbitrary. They followed a pattern dictated by the changing availability of ingredients and the restrictions imposed by religious fasting and feast days. These seasonal and religious influences led to a cuisine that was as varied as it was symbolic, producing dishes that might seem unusual or unexpected to the modern palate. The agricultural calendar governed the harvest and storage of food, which directly influenced what could be served. Spring and summer brought fresh vegetables, herbs, and fruits. Autumn was the time for grain harvests and the slaughter of animals. Winter required reliance on preserved foods such as salted meats, dried fruits, and stored grains. The limited refrigeration and preservation methods meant that menus had to adapt to what was at hand. For example, in early spring, before fresh crops were available, diets could be heavy on salted fish and offal, whereas late summer and autumn offered opportunities for more varied and fresh fare. Religious observance introduced further complexity to the castle diet. The medieval Christian calendar included numerous fasting days and seasons during which the consumption of meat and sometimes dairy was prohibited. Lent, the 40 days preceding Easter, was the most significant fasting period, demanding abstinence from meat and other rich foods. Advent, the period before Christmas and other fasts such as the Ember Days, imposed similar restrictions. On fasting days, fish became a dietary staple. As a result, the castle kitchen developed a wide array of fish dishes, some involving unusual or preserved species, to comply with religious law while providing variety and sustenance. The preparation of these fish dishes was often elaborate, incorporating spices, sauces, and cooking methods that elevated what might otherwise have been seen as a simple substitution. Certain feast days and festivals called for special dishes that highlighted seasonal produce and marked the celebration. For example, Christmas, Easter, and Saints' Days often featured extravagant meals with rare or luxurious ingredients such as venison, swan, or exotic spices. These occasions allowed for indulgence and display, contrasting sharply with the austerity of fasting periods. The influence of religious dietary law extended beyond meat and fish to include dairy products, eggs, and other foods depending on local custom and ecclesiastical interpretation. In some regions these items were permitted during fasts, while in others they were restricted, creating further variation in menus. The interplay between seasonality and religious observance created a dynamic culinary calendar that required skill and creativity from cooks. Planning menus involved anticipation of harvests, preservation of surplus, and careful timing of special dishes. The complexity of these demands contributed to the development of sophisticated food preparation techniques and a diverse range of recipes. In addition to shaping the availability and type of food, the seasonal and religious framework influenced the symbolic meanings attached to dishes. Certain foods were associated with spiritual themes such as purification, sacrifice, or renewal, reflecting the broader cultural context of medieval society. This cyclical approach to food was not only practical, but also deeply embedded in medieval conceptions of time, nature, and faith. Meals were moments where earthly nourishment intersected with divine order, reinforcing the connection between body and soul. As the story of medieval castle cuisine continues, attention now turns to the social aspects of food, the complex etiquette and customs surrounding eating and drinking, which governed behavior at the medieval table and reflected the hierarchical society of the time. In the grand dining halls of medieval castles, the menu was as much a reflection of status and culture as it was a collection of recipes. Among the diverse offerings were numerous dishes that modern palates might find peculiar, ranging from savory pies filled with unexpected ingredients to jellies made from meats and stews with ingredients and combinations that seem offbeat by today's standards. These dishes were commonplace in their time, shaped by the culinary techniques, ingredient availability, and cultural tastes of medieval society. One of the most iconic and widespread medieval dishes was the meat pie. Unlike the sweet fruit-filled pies common today, these pies often contained a blend of meats, sometimes wild game such as venison or boar, combined with spices, fruits like raisins or dates, and thickened sauces. The crusts of these pies were not always intended for eating. Known as coffins, these sturdy pastry cases served as containers for the filling, often discarded after the contents were consumed. The combination of sweet and savory, such as meat mixed with honey or dried fruits, was a signature characteristic of these pies. Jellies and aspics were also popular, though quite different from their modern gelatinous counterparts. Medieval cooks prepared jellies using natural gels derived from boiling animal parts rich in collagen, such as calves' feet or fish skins. These jellies could be flavored with wine, spices, and herbs, often molded into elaborate shapes and served cold. Meat jellies were considered a delicacy, and were used to preserve food as well as to display culinary skill. Stews in medieval castles were hearty and varied, often using whatever ingredients were available. Offbeat combinations might include the use of offal organ meats, pulses, peas, lentils, beans, herbs, and sometimes unusual additives like eggs or cheese. These stews were slow-cooked to tenderize tougher cuts and meld flavors, providing nourishment for all classes of the castle population. The concept of a stew as a mix-and-match dish was practical, allowing cooks to minimize waste and maximize flavor. Another unusual dish was salads, a type of spiced meat dish cooked with fruits and nuts, served cold or hot. These preparations might include combinations such as capon with almonds and pears or pork with figs and vinegar, showcasing the medieval penchant for blending contrasting tastes and textures. Blood dishes also featured in the medieval diet, including black pudding, blood sausage, and blood soups. Blood was valued as a nutritious and economical ingredient, used extensively in cooking. Though less common today, these dishes were considered standard fare and were prepared with spices and grains to enhance flavor. Vegetables were often prepared with heavy seasoning, and sometimes mixed with meat or fish. Pickling and preserving vegetables with vinegar, salt and spices extended their shelf life and introduced tangy flavors. Legumes were common, providing protein and bulk, often cooked into potages or mixed with meats. Sweet dishes, while less dominant than savory ones, included custards and baked goods infused with honey, rosewater and spices. Fruit pastes and compotes were enjoyed, though fresh fruits were often seasonal luxuries. The interplay of sweetness within savory dishes continued to be a defining feature. Many of these dishes were served during feasts and banquets, where presentation and complexity were prized. Recipes required careful preparation, with attention to layering flavors and textures. The communal nature of dining meant that sharing these unusual dishes was both a social and sensory experience. For the modern observer, these culinary traditions offer a glimpse into the medieval mindset, a world where food was a symbol of wealth, an expression of creativity, and a reflection of the era's social and religious values. The dishes might seem strange or even unappetizing, yet they represent the ingenuity and adaptability of cooks working within the constraints and opportunities of their time. As the story of medieval castle cuisine advances, the next focus will be on the storage and preservation techniques that enabled castles to maintain food supplies and sometimes contributed to the unusual nature of their meals. Within the medieval castle, bread and grains formed the foundational elements of daily sustenance, integral not only for their nutritional value but also for their cultural and symbolic significance. Far from being mere staples, these ingredients were woven deeply into the culinary fabric of castle life, appearing in a multitude of forms and preparations, some of which incorporated surprising and unexpected elements that reveal the complexity of medieval food traditions. Bread was the cornerstone of the medieval diet, consumed in some form at nearly every meal across all social strata. However, the type, quality and presentation of bread varied significantly depending on one's social standing. The nobility enjoyed finely milled white bread known as manchet, characterized by its soft texture and refined appearance. In contrast, the lower classes typically consumed coarser, darker breads made from rye, barley or mixed grains, often denser and less refined but providing essential nourishment. The process of bread making was a skilled craft. Milling grain into flour required specialized equipment, and bakers within the castle or nearby village ovens produced a variety of loaves tailored to different purposes. Some breads were plain and utilitarian, while others were enriched with ingredients such as eggs, butter, or milk, elevating their flavor and texture for noble tables. Sweetened breads containing dried fruits, honey or spices appeared during festivals and special occasions, blending the boundaries between staple and delicacy. Grains extended beyond bread into porridges, potages, and various baked goods, creating a rich spectrum of culinary possibilities. Barley, oats and wheat were common, each contributing distinct flavors and textures. Porridges made from these grains provided hearty, warm meals that could be easily supplemented with herbs, vegetables or meat scraps. These dishes were particularly valuable during fasting periods or times of scarcity. Medieval cooks also experimented with grains in unexpected ways. For example, rice, though not native to much of Europe, was imported and used sparingly, often in sweet or savory puddings infused with spices. Similarly, dishes like frumenty, a wheat-based pudding cooked with broth, spices and sometimes sweeteners, were popular among the nobility. These grain preparations could be served hot or cold, plain or richly seasoned, illustrating the adaptability of grains in medieval cuisine. Bread held more than just practical importance. It bore symbolic and ritualistic meaning as well. The sharing of bread was a communal act, reflecting social bonds and hospitality. The form and decoration of bread could signify status or celebrate religious festivals, with shaped loaves and embossed patterns appearing on special occasions. Bread was also linked to spiritual concepts, as seen in the Christian Eucharist, where it represented the body of Christ, further elevating its cultural significance. In the castle kitchen, bread and grains were not isolated items, but part of a complex system involving cultivation, storage, and preparation. Grain storage required careful management to protect against pests, moisture, and spoilage. Granaries and silos within castle estates safeguarded reserves to ensure a steady supply throughout the year. Milling schedules had to be coordinated with baking demands, particularly in large households hosting frequent feasts. The preservation and reuse of bread were also notable practices. Stale bread was often repurposed into breadcrumbs, thickening agents for sauces and soups, or as a base for dishes such as bread pudding or trencher meals, where bread slices served as edible plates absorbing juices and flavors from other foods. Unexpected ingredients occasionally found their way into bread and grain dishes, reflecting both experimentation and necessity. Herbs, seeds, nuts, and even small amounts of meat or fish could be incorporated into dough or porridges, adding complexity and nutrition. The blending of sweet and savory flavors, characteristic of medieval cuisine, extended into grain preparations with honey, dried fruits, and spices frequently used to enhance taste. This central role of bread and grains underscores their importance not only in everyday sustenance but in the social, economic, and cultural life of the castle. Their versatility allowed medieval cooks to meet the demands of a varied diet shaped by season, status, and religious observance. As the culinary narrative of medieval castle life unfolds, attention naturally turns to the exotic ingredients and spices that transformed ordinary dishes into extravagant and sometimes unusual fare, highlighting the global connections and trade networks of the period. Within the culinary landscape of medieval castles, desserts and sweetmeats occupied a curious and often paradoxical position. Far from the ubiquitous confections and delicate pastries familiar to modern diners, medieval sweets were a blend of unusual ingredients, intricate preparation methods, and flavor combinations that might seem foreign or even bizarre to contemporary palates. These sweet offerings not only concluded meals but also served as symbols of wealth, sophistication, and the global trade networks that brought exotic ingredients into the castle kitchen. Exploring the nature of medieval desserts reveals a world where sweetness was both a luxury and a curious curiosity, reflecting the tastes and cultural milieu of the era. The medieval concept of dessert was distinct from today's understanding. Sweet dishes were typically served at the end of a meal but were not always simple or purely sugary. They often combined sweet, savory, and spiced elements in a manner that challenged modern expectations. The balance between sweet and savory, a hallmark of medieval cuisine, extended deeply into desserts, resulting in preparations that might include meats, cheeses, or spices alongside fruits and sugars. Sugar, the key ingredient in medieval sweets, was itself an exotic luxury. In the early Middle Ages, sugar was imported primarily from Arab lands and later from Mediterranean regions. It was rare and expensive, used sparingly by the nobility and in religious communities. Honey, on the other hand, was more widely available and formed the primary sweetener for most dishes. Its use extended from simple honeyed breads to elaborate confections, acting as both flavoring and preservative. Among the common medieval sweetmeats were candied fruits and nuts. Fruits such as citron, orange peel, ginger, and quince were boiled in honey or sugar syrups to create preserves that could be stored and served over extended periods. These candied items were prized for their intense flavors and textures, often enjoyed during festive occasions or as palate cleansers between courses. Marzipan, a paste made from ground almonds and sugar or honey, emerged as a favored medium for sweetmeats and decorative desserts. Skilled artisans molded marzipan into shapes resembling fruits, animals, or flowers, adding an artistic dimension to the culinary experience. The sweet paste was sometimes flavored with rose water or other aromatic essences, reflecting the era's taste for floral and exotic notes. Pastries and tarts, while not ubiquitous, featured in castle menus, often filled with combinations of dried fruits, nuts, spices, and sometimes meats. The blending of these ingredients created layers of flavor complexity. For example, a mince pie, known in medieval England as mince meat, but containing meat, suet, fruits, and spices, offered a savory, sweet fusion that persisted well into later centuries. Jellies and custards, made from almond milk or eggs, provided creamy, rich desserts. These were often thickened with ground nuts or starches, and flavored with spices such as cinnamon, cloves, or saffron. Their preparation required careful technique, as the ingredients were costly and the process delicate. The use of spices was integral to medieval desserts. Cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, mace, and cloves, all imported via long-distance trade routes, infused sweets with warm exotic flavors. These spices signaled status and global connection, as well as adding complexity and medicinal qualities according to contemporary beliefs. The presence of such spices in desserts underscored the blending of luxury and taste. Fruit compotes and stewed fruits were common as well, often served hot or cold with honey or wine reductions. Apples, pears, cherries and berries were among the fruits used, sometimes combined with spices and nuts. These dishes reflected seasonal availability, but also the growing influence of culinary texts that promoted the artful combination of ingredients. One of the more unusual aspects of medieval sweetmeats was the inclusion of savory elements. It was not uncommon to find recipes where fruits were paired with meats or fish, or where cheeses were combined with sweet sauces. This sweet-savory interplay challenged modern distinctions and highlighted the medieval palate's appreciation for contrasts. Preservation techniques played a crucial role in the production of desserts. Sugaring and drying fruits, as well as using honey as a preservative, allowed for year-round availability of ingredients otherwise limited by season. These methods also contributed to the textural variety of sweets, ranging from sticky preserves to brittle confections. Serving sweetmeats was itself a ceremonial act. Elaborate sugar sculptures or marzipan creations were displayed at the banquet's conclusion, symbolizing wealth and refinement. In some cases, these confections were given as gifts or used in diplomatic exchanges, highlighting their social and political significance. The dietary role of desserts was complex. While they provided sweetness and indulgence, medieval thinkers also considered their effects on health and temperament. Excessive sweetness was sometimes viewed with suspicion, and sweets were often consumed in moderation or as part of a balanced meal. The global origins of many dessert ingredients speak to the interconnectedness of medieval Europe with distant lands. The importation of sugar, spices, nuts and exotic fruits was facilitated by trade routes spanning the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and beyond. Castles, as centers of power and wealth, were privileged recipients of these goods, incorporating them into their culinary repertoire. In sum, medieval desserts and sweetmeats were far from uniform or predictable. They encompassed a rich tapestry of ingredients, techniques and meanings, reflecting the tastes, trade and cultural values of the time. Their unusual combinations and exotic flavors challenge modern assumptions and invite a deeper appreciation of the medieval culinary imagination. As this exploration of castle cuisine draws closer to its conclusion, the narrative now turns to the everyday challenges faced in storing and preserving food, which profoundly shaped what could be served and when within the medieval castle. The culinary traditions of medieval castles, with their elaborate feasts, unusual dishes, and symbolic food rituals, represent a vivid chapter in history. Yet, as the medieval era waned, so too did many of these distinctive foodways. The decline of medieval castle cuisine was neither sudden nor singular in cause. Rather, it was a complex process shaped by sweeping political, economic, social, and cultural transformations that gradually rendered many medieval culinary practices obsolete or transformed them into new forms. At the heart of this decline lay the shifting political landscape of Europe. The consolidation of centralized monarchies and the gradual emergence of nation-states in the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance altered patterns of power and wealth distribution. The feudal system, which had underpinned medieval society and sustained castle life, began to erode as noble families lost their autonomous domains or were absorbed into broader political entities. The large-scale household economies that supported grand castle kitchens became less common. The great castles themselves, once the seats of power and opulence, often fell into disuse or were transformed into palaces or administrative centers with different culinary cultures. The economics of food production and supply evolved alongside these political changes. Advances in agriculture and trade expanded the availability and variety of foodstuffs, introducing new ingredients and cooking methods. The rising merchant class and urbanization altered consumption patterns, with a growing demand for different types of food in burgeoning cities. Market economies and improved transportation networks reduced the reliance of noble households on their own estates for sustenance, changing the nature of food procurement and preparation. In tandem with these economic shifts, tastes and culinary preferences evolved. influenced by new ideas, cultural exchanges, and technological advancements. The influx of ingredients from the New World after the 15th century, including potatoes, tomatoes, and maize, revolutionized European diets, but also marked a departure from traditional medieval fare. Renaissance humanism and scientific inquiry fostered new attitudes toward food, emphasizing pleasure, balance, and innovation over medieval notions of humoral balance and symbolic meaning. Medieval cuisine's hallmark features, such as the pervasive blending of sweet and savory flavors, the elaborate use of spices as symbols of wealth, and the theatrical presentations of dishes, gradually gave way to simpler and more restrained culinary styles. The rich, heavily spiced dishes and extravagant pies that once adorned castle tables became less fashionable as refined tastes favored fresher ingredients and subtler seasonings. Religious practices also shifted, influencing food culture. While medieval fasting regulations had mandated specific dietary restrictions that shaped menus, the early modern period saw a relaxation of these rules in many regions. This relaxation allowed for a broader range of foods to be consumed more regularly, diminishing the prominence of fish dishes and elaborate fasting alternatives that had been staples of medieval cooking. Technological advancements further altered food preparation and preservation. The improved understanding of refrigeration, canning, and food safety reduced the necessity for heavy salting, smoking, and spicing used to mask or preserve flavors. This evolution allowed for fresher, cleaner tastes, contrasting with the strong, often pungent flavors characteristic of medieval dishes. The decline of medieval castle cuisine was also reflected in changing social structures. The rigid hierarchies that had dictated access to certain foods and presentation styles became less pronounced. Dining customs became more democratic, influenced by broader social mobility and the emergence of new social classes. The emphasis on feasting as a display of power and prestige diminished in some contexts, replaced by more intimate and varied forms of dining. Despite these declines, many medieval culinary traditions did not disappear entirely, but instead were transformed and absorbed into emerging cuisines. Some dishes evolved, shedding their more unusual ingredients or preparation methods, while retaining their names or symbolic associations. Others influenced the development of regional specialties that persist today. The legacy of medieval food culture can be traced in the richness of European gastronomy, even as its more peculiar aspects faded from common practice. The study of this decline provides valuable insight into the broader historical processes of cultural change. It illustrates how food, far from being static, reflects the dynamic interplay of politics, economy, religion, and social values. The waning of medieval castle cuisine underscores the adaptability of human tastes and the continuous evolution of culinary art. As the narrative of medieval castle food draws near its end, the following points will consider the lasting legacy of these traditions and how they continue to inform modern understandings of medieval life and gastronomy. The culinary traditions of medieval castles, rich with strange foods, unusual flavor combinations, and intricate preparations, might seem to belong solely to a distant and vanished era. Yet, these ancient foodways have left an enduring legacy that continues to influence modern cuisine in subtle and sometimes surprising ways. Exploring the traces of medieval castle foods in contemporary dishes reveals a fascinating dialogue between past and present, where centuries-old tastes, techniques, and ingredients persist, transformed by time but still echoing their origins. Many of the distinctive elements of medieval cuisine have found new life within regional and national culinary traditions. Some medieval dishes have survived relatively intact, albeit adapted to modern tastes, while others have inspired the development of new recipes or contributed to broader gastronomic trends. This continuity illustrates the dynamic nature of food culture as a living tradition, shaped by history yet continually reinvented. One prominent legacy is the medieval penchant for pies and pastries, which remain central to many European cuisines. The savory pies of medieval banquets, often containing a rich mix of meats, fruits, spices, and nuts, can be seen as precursors to modern dishes such as the English meat pie, French pâté en croûte, or Italian torta salata. The layering of sweet and savory elements, characteristic of medieval pies, survives in contemporary recipes that combine fruits like apples or raisins with meats or cheeses, reflecting an enduring appreciation for complex flavor profiles. Another notable influence is found in the use of spices and sweeteners. While the lavish and heavy use of exotic spices declined after the medieval period, the legacy of these flavors persists in the seasoning of many traditional dishes. Cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves and ginger, once symbols of luxury and status, remain staples in both savory and sweet recipes. For example, spiced cakes, mulled wines and holiday desserts across Europe reflect these medieval flavor traditions. The continued popularity of honey as a natural sweetener and preservative also harks back to its vital role in medieval kitchens. The tradition of preserved and candied fruits, a hallmark of medieval sweetmeats, endures in modern confectionery and baking. Candied citrus peels, glazed fruits, and marzipan decorations are common features of festive foods, maintaining a connection to the elaborate and artistic desserts crafted in castle kitchens. Marzipan, in particular, continues to be a favored ingredient in holiday baking and cake decorating, embodying the artistic spirit of medieval culinary craftsmanship. Certain cooking techniques that originated or were refined during the medieval period have also left their mark. The practice of slow cooking stews and potages, blending meats, legumes and vegetables, remains a cornerstone of comfort food in many cultures. Dishes such as French cassoulet, British hot pot, and Irish stew can trace their ancestry to the hearty, resourceful preparations typical of medieval castle kitchens. The use of offal and less commonly consumed animal parts, once a necessity and culinary norm in the Middle Ages, has experienced a resurgence in contemporary nose-to-tail dining movements. Modern chefs increasingly emphasize sustainability and respect for whole animals, reviving traditional recipes that utilize organs, heads, and other components once sidelined in favor of prime cuts. This renaissance reflects a renewed appreciation for the culinary ingenuity embedded in medieval food culture.